Well, we are making excellent progress, and I want to now add the last major part to this application. It's a ListView activity. So remember the original design for the history of the bowling scores was going to look like this. That looks much nicer than what we actually will come up with in this video. But that's where we are now. We need to see the historical data that gets entered. So here's the app, and the save button works, and it puts the data in the database, but the show history button doesn't do anything as of right now. So to get there, we're going to work in the bowling scores class a little bit. We want to have the running average. That's this column here. So in this game, if your average was 200, then that 200 is going to be averaged in with these games. So your average will be running. That means your average will go up and down based on all of the history. If you're not a bowler, you don't really maybe understand why that works the way it does. But it's just how we keep track of whether we're getting better or not. So we're going to add a new activity with a view, and the view that we'll use is a composite, a list view that's already provided as part of Android. So it's fairly easy to get a long way, and then it's fairly complicated to get further than that. So we will use an intent to switch from the enter scores activity to this new activity, and we did that in the here and there application right at the beginning. And this is the list view that we're going to use. We'll customize it with an adapter. So let's go into the code immediately and start working on the bowling scores class. So I'll pop this open a little bit so that we can see what we're doing. So there's the activity, and there's the bowling scores class, and we're going to work in here. So this should be kind of familiar to you. We're in the bowling scores class, and we're going to add some typical Java stuff, and we're also going to whatever that means, we're going to add one more instance variable in here. It will be the running average. So this kind of makes sense. A bowling scores has a running average. So each week, or however often you bowl, you will have a new running average. That running average is associated with this date. And it's not determined only based on this data, it's the historical data. So we're going to add a method to calculate the running average. Some tricky thoughts here. I don't want to call this method all the time. Meaning every time you enter some scores, maybe I don't need to update all of the running averages, only when you need to see them. So I'm going to add I'll move this method down below later. It shouldn't be here at the top, but I'm going to add a static method called update running averages. Well, I wasn't looking at the keyboard. Update running average. And it's going to take an array list of bowling scores so you know what that is. That's the data associated with the application, and it's not known here, so we're going to import it with the help of Eclipse. Now, let's start out with keeping track of how many weeks have gone by, and we'll initialize that to 1. and we're going to keep a total. I'm going to make this a long, because these numbers might get big, and initialize that to 0. That's going to be the total of all of the games that we've ever played in this history. And let's see. I'm going to put a check in here. If all bowling scores size is greater than 0, that means that we have some data to work with. And now an enhanced for loop for this is the so-called for each loop in Java for bowling scores. A local variable BS, stop laughing, in all bowling scores. So do you know what's happening here? Each time through this for loop, we will take one object of type bowling scores out of this array list, and it will be known as this local variable BS. So it's a little bit easier than a traditional for loop that has for I gets 0, I is less than the size, and so on. So this automatically gets one object out of the array list for us, one object of type bowling scores. So let's add to the total the we have a method already to calculate the series score for that bowling scores object. So we have the total of all the games so far is in total. And that means that for that bowling scores object, we can set the running average to the total divided by the number of weeks that have gone by times 3. I'm not sure that weeks is a good name for that. I'm kind of assuming that you play one set of games per week. Okay, and we don't have a set running average. Let's ask Eclipse to help us with that. So we're going to say source, generate getters and setters. Get and set running average. Okay, and it will drop those in there where we don't really want them, but I'll rearrange things later. And then weeks plus plus. So it's really that easy. The tricky part of this is when do we want to call this method? And I think we should call it when we need to display the history. And that's the only time that you actually get to see the running average of your bowling scores. Okay, so now something that we probably should have done before. I'm going to ask this class to implement the comparable interface, and I'll use the new generic form. So it's, if we agree to implement the comparable interface for bowling scores, that means that we must have a method called compare_to. I think we can ask Eclipse to add the unimplemented methods for us. So this doesn't compile yet because we haven't implemented those methods. There's actually only one. So if we ask it to add it for us, and it put it way down here at the bottom. That's okay. So we have a bowling scores object that's passed in. I hope that you understand what's going on here. This is for when we want to compare two objects of type bowling scores. And I'm going to compare them based on their date. So we're going to declare a difference variable and then set that to something and then return it. So return 0 would mean that they all are the same. We're going to return the difference between this and that. So this is the object that was used to call this method, and that is the object that was passed in. And I'm going to use the date object in this and use its compare_to method and compare it to that. So do you see what happens? If we just compare, if we just want to compare the date objects that are inside of the bowling scores object, then we can ask the date class compare_to method to give us the result. And if you feel like it, you can do a this dot here. So this dot date compare to that dot date. Okay, we need to override the equals method. So public boolean equals, and it takes an object of type object, and I'll also call it that. So in this case, what we want to do is compare two bowling scores objects for equality. And I'm going to say that these two, this and that, bowling scores object are equal when their dates are equal. So when you're overriding the equals method from the object class, you must pass in an object. We know that it's going to be of type bowling scores, but you have to pass in an object. So I'm going to do this in 2 steps. I'm going to say a local bowling scores object is a downcast of that. So all it does is it gives the object passed in the right runtime or compile time data type. So all in one go, we can say return this date equals bowling scores date. So we're doing the same thing that we did in the compare_to method. We're using the equals method of the date class to compare the two bowling scores object. And we're going to say that those two bowling scores objects are equal if their dates are the same. When you implement the equals and compare_to method, they have to be in sync with each other. So if you compare two objects and you say that their difference is 0, then your equals method must return true. Does that make sense? If the difference between two objects is 0, then they must be equal. And conversely, if the equals method returns false, the compare_to method must not return 0. So these two methods, equals and compare_to, need to be in sync with each other. And I'm going to move these up above the toString method. It's just kind of the way that I like to find things. Go up to the top. This accessor and mutator, I'm going to move those down with the other accessors and mutators. How about in there? And this static method to update the running averages, I'm going to put that down near the bottom as well, just above the toString. Okay, you might be wondering why I bothered to implement equals and compare to, and why I only used the date of the bowling scores. You would think maybe I'd want them sorted by the highest scores or something like that. But I had a specific reason for doing that. When we get the data out of the database, we have a choice of asking the database to sort it for us or sorting it ourselves. I prefer to sort things myself, and we can do that using a method in the collections class. Sort, and pass it a list. Well, all bowling scores is a perfectly good list. So a sort algorithm is provided for us, and we don't really have to do anything special. It can sort these objects, but it will sort them based on how we decide to compare them to each other. So we decide which one comes before which one by implementing compare to and equals, and then this algorithm looks at the objects in this list that we passed it, and it calls those objects compare to and equals methods. It's also the reason why compare to and equals have to be in sync with each other, because this sort algorithm will get really confused if you start saying things like these two objects are equal but their difference is 27. So the sort algorithm is expecting that you would have met the contract of implementing those two methods. I want to play in the toString method just a little bit, because we have not output the running average, which now is an instance variable in this class. So if I say, this is a little bit jammed up here. When you break a line in Java, you take the operator with you to the beginning of the new line. So if I put I don't even have to call the accessor. I can just put running average. But that's going to be a double, and I don't want like my average to be 175.666666. I'm going to format that double using the static format method out of the string class. So if you're a C programmer, %.1f might mean something to you. That means that I'm going to put one place past the decimal, and let me see, what do we have now? We have the database ID, and then we have the date formatted as a medium. Okay, I'm going to change this. I'm going to change that format to be short. And I'm going to take the database ID out of the toString. I'll drop it there in a comment. The database ID was quite useful to us when we were working with the database, but now that that stuff is working, maybe I should add another kind of a toString log method that would include data, all of the data that would be interesting to see during debugging, as opposed to the string version of this bowling scores object, which will be interesting to the user. So this string is the string that I'm going to put on the interface. I'm just going to throw the objects onto the list view, and it will automatically convert them to this string. So far so good. Everything is still compiling, and we've updated the bowling scores class to have a running average, to implement the comparable interface, and we added a static method for calculating the running averages. So the next thing that we need is a layout for the history activity. So I'm going to right click on this folder and say new, and then pick other. Under Android, I'm going to make an Android XML file. The file is going to be history layout .xml, and the root element is going to be a linear layout. That's the default, and that would be fine. See what that gives us. Okay, so it does give us a place to start building the layout for the history, and the properties of the linear layout that it gives us, let's just peek in here. Wow, I don't have many pixels, do I? I'm not really sure if I have to do this or not, but when the orientation is not set, that makes me uncomfortable. So this is going to be a vertical layout, and the background, we already have an image someplace for that. Where is that image? Under drawable floors. Floor C, actually. I took 3 of them, A, B, and C, and decided to use C. Okay, so we have the same background in this layout that we had in the enter scores layout. That will give some consistency to the application. Now, I'm going to add to this layout another linear layout. So come over here to layouts, and I'm going to put a linear layout in here, and this is going to be the header, so the column header for the history. And instead of linear layout 1, let's call it well, I don't really care what it's called. Its height, wrap content, that means it will be as high as it needs to be, and its width, match parent. I'm okay with those. I want the orientation to be horizontal. I'm going to put some text in there. Okay, let's go into the widgets and say text view. If I add one there, now it takes the amount of space that it needs, and then I'm going to add another text view, and I'm going to do this a few times. 1, 2, 3, date, game 1, game 2, game 3, the series, and the running average. Okay, so did those go in the right place? They did. So I've got 5 text views. Those are going to be the column headers. And the properties of the first one, I'm going to change the text to date and put a space there. Maybe 2 spaces. Maybe 2 spaces. And then the next one, this is really tricky. If you click over here and then click properties, you sometimes don't seem to get the right one. So I'm in the habit now of clicking on the exact one that I want in the outline and then looking at the properties of that. And I'm going to call that one game 1 with a space after it so they don't all run together. And that one will be game 2 with a space. This one is for the series total. I'll just call it series. And the last one I'm going to call average. And there's still a little bit of room for improvement in the spacing here, but I will leave that as an exercise for the reader, the watcher. And now we need to add all of the data in here. And the good news is that some of this is already done for us. This is a very typical thing to want to put onto an Android app, that we have a list of things. So in the widgets that you have, one of them is called a list view. There are a whole bunch of these, and I can tell you that I kind of hit a snag here by trying to understand the most complicated one first. And I wanted it to appear exactly the way I wanted it, and I decided, okay, I'm going to first of all understand how this works. And I'm going to drop the simplest list view in here, and now we have list view 1, and I'm going to change its properties just a little bit. I think that the height should be to match the parent. So now our data is going to go here in this list view. One more thing before I leave this. I'm going to add scroll bars, because we're going to have a whole lot of data in here at some point. So on the scroll bars, I'm going to add vertical scroll bars. Now, what I don't want you to do is to change the ID here. Oh, maybe we need to. Just a second here, this is tricky. This says it's creating a new ID for an object called ListView 1. I don't want that. I want the ID of this object to be at Android ID / list. Okay, so this is a known identifier, and we're going to use that in our activity, the history activity. Okay, so we've got no red squigglies anymore, and if you're surprised at how fast we built this, it took me a long time, if that makes you feel any better. Okay, let's go and build the activity and wire it up to the other activity. So we're going to go back in here, and I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call this the history activity, and its parent is going to be something that's provided specifically for an activity that uses a list view, and it's going to be list activity. That's the parent class. If I do a control space, it should find it, an Android app list activity, and that will help us. It will fill in some stuff for us. And here it is. So what does this history activity need? We have to implement, you might remember this, it's been a while, we're going to ask it to override or implement some methods. There's a whole bunch of them, and we only need one. Where is it? Under activity, on create. So this is the method that gets called automatically when an instance of this class is created, when this activity is created. Okay, let's add an instance variable to the history activity. Private bowling scores. No, it's an array list of bowling scores, sorry. An array list of bowling scores. All bowling scores. It doesn't know about this, so let's import it. And we're going to get the data from the application. Remember that we did that once before, so the application is the kind of overarching class that doesn't have this temporary life cycle like the individual activities has. So we need to set the content view here. And the layout that we've created for it is in the R layout, and it is called history layout. Let Eclipse help you. It doesn't make as many typing errors as I do. So now let's ask the application for the data. So remember this, my bowling scores application, the app gets this is a downcast. That's a little bit better. My bowling scores application and we have this method that's available everywhere called getApplication, and it returns an object of type application. Here it is, application. But our subclass is my bowling scores application, and it's that object that allows us to get the data. So all bowling scores gets ask the app to get all the bowling scores. So far so good. We made a static method in the bowling scores class. So if we type the name of the class bowling scores, we should have, here is the static method that we created for updating the bowling scores, the running averages in the bowling scores. So remember that that information is not in the database, it's calculated, and we calculate it when we need it. So this, what do we have so far? We have an activity that when it's created, we assign this new layout to it, and then we go and get the data from the application, and we make sure that the data is updated. And now we have the job of putting that data onto the list view, onto the history layout. And this is the part that, well, it's easy to code when you understand what's going on, but it's difficult to understand conceptually. So there's something called an adapter pattern, and an adapter means that it's going to look after the job of putting the data into the view. So the adapter pattern looks like this. There's the view, that's our layout, and there's our data, which is the bowling scores, and all of the work of going between those two is called an adapter. So the list view is a very, very common kind of a view, and all we need to do is to associate our data with that list view. And we do that by assigning the list adapter. So set list adapter, I'm going to see if I can do this in a way that makes sense to you. Not guaranteed. We're going to make an array adapter. So an array adapter that deals with bowling scores objects it needs a reference to the class that we're in, and it needs a reference to Android in the resources, in layout. There is something called a simple list item. And then we're going to put our list, all bowling scores. And I've apparently done something wrong. Oh, I see. I have to import array adapter. Apparently I've done something else wrong. Oh, too many parentheses. Too many parentheses. I hope you were all yelling at me for that. Okay, this is a very, very small amount of code for what it achieves. And it's also fairly difficult to understand. So there is something called an array adapter, and it plays this role of going between the view and the data. So all we have to do is to say that this list adapter that's associated with the list activity. So we got this method set list adapter because we're in a list activity. We're specifying that the items on the list are going to use this simple format, and each of the items in this array are going to be one item on the list. And if you're saying, well, that doesn't look at all like what I described, it's a lot of digging through the examples and the documentation. A lot of times I find that when I get stuck and frustrated, it's because I attempted to go too far in one step. And digging through the documentation is really kind of painful, and looking at the examples is a little bit more successful. So this is a very simple way of making an activity that has the primary job of displaying a list. So that's just so common that they provided it for us, that we would do it using their list activity class and their array adapter. Okay, so we have an activity, but it's not yet wired in. What does that mean? When we click on this button, it doesn't do anything. So we have to associate this button with switching to this history activity that we've just created. So that's what we'll do next. So in our enter scores activity, we have a button already called the history button. So we know about that guy. And we have retrieved it from the layout by this find view by ID thing. But that history button doesn't have any handler method associated with it. So let's go and get the Enter Scores layout. I'm not sure why this takes so long to catch up with me. Whoops. Oh, sorry about that. I hadn't clicked on graphical layout. Okay, so the Show History button is the one that we're interested in right now. And if we look at the properties of the Show History button, the on-click doesn't have any method associated with it, so I'm going to add the property there, handle show history click. So it's going to look for that method if someone clicks on the Show History button. I'm going to copy that because I made something so long I don't want to type it again. I'll make mistakes. So in Enter Scores activity, we have a handler here for changing the date. Let's add another handler here. Public void. That's what I called it. No, darn it. Handle show history click. It takes a view. Now we're going to tax your memory and go way back to when we did the over here and over there application. We have to make an intent. And the purpose of the intent is to take us, in this case, it's to take us from one activity to another. So we're going from this to the history activity. And we put .class here. What this is really doing is it's going to say it will go and load the class file for history activity. So there's historyactivity.java. The compiled.class file is the target, and we need to import that one. So this is really fairly easy. Start activity and pass in the intent that we just created. And we're done. If someone clicks on that button, it will execute this and switch us to the history activity. Well, should we be very, very brave and just try and run the whole thing and see what it does? Do a save all. Make sure there are no red squigglies, and I will put the, yeah, that's awfully big, isn't it? That's okay. Let's just run it and see what happens. Watch the console, and we can also look at what's going on in the DDMS. The DDMS is really very helpful, even though there's a whole lot of stuff going on in there. If an exception is thrown, it will be in there. Okay, so we've got a whole lot of bowling scores where I just hit enter, 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 enter. And a space is missing there. So 300, 300, 300, and average is 0.0. So there's our first bug that we've noticed. And it seems like the emulator is now running the enter scores activity, which is the main one. And if we click on show history, it blows up. Please try again. Force the close. Okay, I'm kind of glad that happened, because you're getting that all the time and you're saying, oh no, it's horrible. Go into the log of the DDMS and try and find out where there was an exception. Okay, so here's where we got the data out of the database. Some of this I don't really understand what's going on. We started an intent, the one that has to do with history, so that's good. But then that's bad. We shut down the virtual machine. An uncaught exception. There was an illegal state exception. We could not execute method of the activity. From there, we were... So all of this is what was going on when that happened. Could not execute method of the activity. Does anyone know what happened yet? Because I think I do. Aha! Okay. Here's a better clue. The activity not found exception. Unable to find explicit activity class in your Android manifest XML. Okay, you have these messages are so long you have to hover over them, and this is the problem. We didn't remember. Why didn't you tell me? We didn't remember to update the manifest. Every activity has to be described in the manifest. Whoops. Typing XML for me is so difficult. So what do we have to say about the activity? We have to say what the name of it is. And it is called history activity. We don't have to do anything other than that. Check the console and see if you've got any nasty parsing errors from typing XML incorrectly. We had a very bad bug earlier where a dot here instead of a colon caused all sorts of problems. There was no recognition of the application, the parent application class, and yeah, that took a long time to figure out. Okay, so I'm going to save this and I'm going to just run again and see what happens. So let's watch the console, probably from within the DDMS. So we're getting some data out of the database and we're on the enter scores activity, so far so good. If I click on show history, so it's kind of working. So here's the header, here's the dates, the scores, and the average. And there's a whole lot of data in here where I just clicked save, 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 save. Are these in order? 6, 9, 6, 10. The data is not very interesting for testing this. And we also have kind of an ugliness here where there's no space between the game. Oh, and the series is missing. So our toString method has got a few bugs in it. So we have a working activity. I'm going to go back and fix those obvious bugs in the toString method. How do we get from this activity back to the enter scores activity? Well, we're going to use the back button. It's the activities are on a stack called the back stack, and if you want to get to the previous one, you can just use the back button. And Android users will expect that to be the case. So I'm probably not going to, on the history, I'm probably not going to bother to put a button to say go back to the other screen, because people would assume that to get back there they would click the back button. Okay, so let's put that minimized for a second and go back into the Java perspective. What do we need to do? In bowling scores, I probably have like everything open at the same time. Now it's the only one I didn't have open. In bowling scores, the toString method, it has game 1, game 2, game 3, and then it does not have the series. I wanted to have the calculate series score. So let's put a space there. Calculate series score. Follow that with a space. And then the running average formatted with one place past the decimal. Let's see if that looks better. So 300, 300, 300, 900, and then there's the average 300. And it just barely fits on this screen. And the headers don't exactly match. And these don't exactly look like columns. A grid might be nice. But there's something that we can scroll through, and if we were on an actual device instead of an emulator, we could do things like flick to look through the data, go back, enter some more data. So that wasn't really as hard, or at least it didn't look as hard to you as the other things that we've done. But we have an application now with 2 activities and a database behind it, and we've still got some ugliness. This interface is not exactly what I would like. So what are we going to do next? Well, we have some polishing in the user interface, some user interaction issues, which I think we can fix fairly simply. So here's the big thing that we need functionally the application to allow the user to delete data that was entered incorrectly or it's too old, and I would like us to use the menu button for that. So we haven't used the menu button at all, and it will be fairly easy, I hope, knock on wood, to select data from that history list and remove it from the database. So we'll need a delete from the database. And then we need an application icon that meets the standards. We need to test it on a whole bunch of virtual devices and make some adjustments, and then test on physical devices and ship it, deploy it to the App Store. And I don't know if, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. So what did we do in this one? We made some changes to the bowling scores class to calculate the running average using a static method, and we added one more instance variable to the class. We implemented the comparable interface and the equals method. We implemented the comparable interface and we overrode the equals method so that we could sort the data using the collections class. Then we added the second activity, and we used a list activity. We inherited from list activity, and we put the data on that list view very simply in one line of code using a list adapter. And then we created an intent to switch from one activity to another. So we wired up the history button, the show history button, so that we could get to the other activity and display the history of the data. Okay, we're making really good progress. I hope this is going well for you, and I will see you in the next segment.